Hey folks, Dr. Mike here with Renaissance Periodization, and today's video is about how to deadlift for growth. If you're gonna deadlift for growth. Now here's the deal. The deadlift has been maligned in some cases by myself personally as maybe not the best growth exercise. Why? The range of motion isn't amazing. Not a whole lot of muscles are being put under a stretch. It's not exactly sure which muscle is specifically the focus because the deadlift does such a good job of distributing load over many muscles. It's difficult to have a situation where it's really a target muscle without altering the deadlift at a pretty fine level of technical execution. And probably most importantly, the stimulus to fatigue ratio of the deadlift, because it is so fatiguing, is often just not as great as other exercises that are comparable. For example, if you want a big back and your option is to deadlift versus bent row, I think bent row is usually a better choice. That doesn't mean they're always a better choice though. And in some cases, especially for beginners and intermediates and in some other special cases, deadlifts are an excellent tool for growing muscle. But how you use deadlifts to grow muscle is a big deal and can be the difference between being like, man, why'd I do deadlifts again for 6 weeks? I just feel like shit. And I think I'm not much bigger, versus, wow, I'm glad I included deadlifts and I can see these thick slabs of beef on my insert muscle group here. Specifically, I have 7 tips for you today as to how to improve the way you do deadlifts if you choose to do them for muscle growth. And I'm assuming that you already have calculated that the deadlift will be a good enough stimulus to fatigue ratio exercise for you to make it a logically valid alternative at least some of the time compared to other stuff you're doing in the gym. All right. First, number 1 is picking the right deadlift for the job. In my view, if you're training the glutes, for example, 2 very good options for the deadlift are deficit sumo, which seems to target the glutes very much, and the deficit puts the glutes in a huge stretch, which is a huge part of the growth process, or a conventional deadlift that looks like a stiff-legged deadlift in most of its execution. However, you bend the knees the entire time just enough to keep the tension off of the hamstrings. Your back is flat, your knees bend as you go down, just enough to keep the hams out of it, and you go to a deficit so at the bottom your glutes are stretched like crazy. Because your back is tight, and preferably you wear a good weightlifting belt, and your hamstrings aren't the fundamental prime movers because they have been put into insufficiency by you moving your knees forward, your glutes are the absolute prime mover, number 1, and number 2 are also at a loaded stretch at the bottom of the movement. Sounds like a big win for the glutes. If you want to train your back, the best kind of deadlift to do is probably the conventional kind, and as a matter of fact, from a deficit. The thing is, the deficit is made from you bending your knees a little bit more than usual, bending your hips a bit more than usual, and or rounding your back a little bit. If you start with higher reps and ease in, you will not automatically die and have a herniation of the spine while rounding the back in the deadlift. But if it's for higher reps and it's under control and it's to a good deficit, some degree of back flexion and then extending the back on the concentric is gonna really grow the living shit out of your back, quite safely, I might add. Deadlifts that are not in this 2 category of things, we essentially have 3 types of deadlifts: deficit sumo, deficit conventional for the glutes, and then a deficit regular conventional with a bent back for back. If the deadlifts you're using for hypertrophy are not in that situation, if they're not one of those 3, does that mean they're going to be functionless? No. Does that mean I think you could be using something more effective? Yes. In most cases, absolutely. So if someone does a deadlift for hypertrophy that's not one of these, I'm interested to hear their reasoning, but I'm assuming that maybe they didn't do a lot of reasoning or just haven't thought the issue through. For example, a lot of people like rack pulls. I'm going to tell you one of the only reasons that people like rack pulls. It is to be able to put a lot of weight on the bar and have a chance to yell so the whole gym is impressed, or to delude themselves into thinking they're working very hard. IFBB pros are amazing at doing this. The rack pull is mostly a gigantic waste of time, although it's a great way to isometrically grow your traps. The rack pull is just not a very thought out movement. I'm not so sure what it trains, and don't worry, its advocates also are not sure what it trains. What about the hex bar deadlift, especially with the handles turned up? Well, if you bring the deadlift close to your center of gravity, it begins more to be a leg movement in a partial range and less of a back movement. Your legs are stronger than your back, which is why you can usually hex bar deadlift more than you can regular deadlift. But even if especially if you use the handles that pop out. The hex bar deadlift is a very partial range of motion, which again, you can use a shitload of weight to do exactly what? I'm not sure. And I don't even know what muscle is targeted anymore because the quads, the adductors, the hamstrings, the glutes, and the back all spread the load so evenly in a hex deadlift. It makes it the perfect candidate for maximum load lifting because you milk all the muscles out in their best anatomically favorable positions, but you really don't put any muscle at a disadvantage, put it under a loaded stretch, and is thus, I'm not sure what the target for hypertrophy is. Of course, there are exceptions to this, but generally speaking, I do prefer these kinds of deadlifts to the ones that many people do, I would say erroneously, by a small margin for hypertrophic gain. Number 2 tip is to do slow, controlled eccentrics. It is really fun to drop your deadlifts really fast. If you're a power lifter and you want to go for a very high percentage of your max lifts without accruing as much fatigue as you need, dropping your deadlifts or riding them down, because you're not allowed to drop on competition, having your hands on it, but riding down pretty fast is a really, really good idea. If you're using the deadlifts for growth, we already know that eccentric contractions are at least very powerful for growth, if not even better than concentric contractions. So then, why the fuck would you drop the deadlift? Well, the reason is, do you want more reps or more weight? If you have to eccentrically control your deadlifts, you get more hypertrophy, but it is more painful to your ego because you're not as strong as you thought you were. Huge recommendation there. And it takes the injury probability and shrinks it substantially at the expense of the ego, of course. Number 3 tip is to do a very gentle touch at the bottom. You can do a full stop at the bottom, but then getting the deadlift off of the floor is actually pretty hard work. And that requires a lot of neurological drive. And the movement from static to start, from isometric to concentric, isn't particularly hypertrophic. But a gentle touch allows you a nice little stretch reflex. It also puts a shitload of tension on the muscles that you're targeting when they're under their maximum stretch in the lift. And because it's very gentle, it is a super, super low risk. It's just a matter of kind of finding out where the floor is, noting it, touching gently, and coming back up. And because you have to control all the way down slow, you have a very powerful eccentric contraction all the way to the loaded stretch. Holy shit, that's a recipe for big ass gains, and it will make you sore, and you will notice that shit. Number 4, I recommend sets of 5 to 15 repetitions. Anything more than 15 reps is really just a cardio thing with deadlifts, and then you're not really training a muscle in most cases. Anything less than 5 is not enough volume per set to grow as much muscle as possible. So that's kind of ruled out the other ends of the range. Number 5, consider the systemic and axial fatigue you're imposing, especially by arranging your workout within the week and picking what movements you do for the other exercises for the week. It's probably not wise to do deadlifts and stiff-legged deadlifts and good mornings and 2 different kinds of bent rows and flexion rows in the same week. And if you're going to do some of those things in the same week, I'd say move half of them out to the next time you do a program. And then the ones that are remaining, push away from the deadlift so that you get some even distribution of how much you are straining your spine and your back and all that stuff. Deadlifts really beat the shit out of you axially. They load the spine a ton, which isn't a bad thing. It's just very fatiguing. And also they beat the shit out of your muscles a ton, specifically muscles in your lower back. If you need them for stability and power generation and other lifts, you had better make sure the deadlifts occur after those lifts, or there's a few days between when you deadlift heavy and when you squat heavy, or when you do good mornings and when you do stuff like a deadlift. Just be smart about it and understand that your lower back and your core and your ability to load axially through the spine can be more limited than your other sources of fatigue. So you're like, write down your plan. And you're like, it's not that many exercises. How the fuck am I so beat up? Because you noticed, 4 out of the 6 back exercises I chose really involve a lot of spinal loading, heavily involve the lumbar muscles and the spinal erectors all the way through. And I just like, okay, I should have known they don't recover as fast, which is really the case. Number 6, keep your technique spotless and slowly progress in load over time. Why is this advice for the deadlift specifically? I mean, it's true for everything. But with the deadlift, I think people get carried away, and even bodybuilders who have deadlifts in the program, they end up like just putting a shitload of weight on the bar, just fucking going to town. Everything goes out the window and it just turns into an ego lift. There are many, many top pros who still do this. Their entire financial situation, or at least proximately, depends on them staying injury-free, and they go and deadlift 600, 700, 800 pounds plus and make Instagram posts about it. On the one hand, mad respect, you're strong as shit. On the other hand, the fuck are you doing? Are you trying to use this deadlift for strength as a side hobby? Sweet, as long as you've accepted the injury risk, no worries. But if you're thinking this really helps hypertrophy, if you really, really want to help hypertrophy, you can make sure that your technique is always good and you're gently progressing in load over time. You may still eventually get very, very strong in the deadlift, but it has to be a situation where you added 5 or 10 pounds every time, not one where you usually lift 4 plates and you come in and you're like, I'm fucking feeling it, brothers. Put 5 fucking wheels on the bar. You know, if you call plates wheels, you're the fucking man. Lastly, point number 7. When you're training your glutes with deadlifts, you can do them at the beginning, middle, or end of the workout. Generally, it's a very favorable effect. If you're training your back, I would recommend that you save your deadlifts for the very end of the workout for 2 reasons. Reason number 1 is your back will be so beat up by the time you get to deadlifts, it'll already be the limiting factor. In your deadlifts, your glutes and hams can easily power the deadlift. And if your back is still really fucking strong too, you need to stress your glutes and hams a shitload, put a shitload of volume and weight through them to get the effect you want for your back. But if your back is already tired and it's going to give out technique-wise, you're just not going to be able to straighten yourself out anymore. When it's tired, you're going to need that many fewer sets and reps and load to expose your glutes and everything else to. That's a really, really, really big deal. In addition to that, the deadlift systemically fatigues you like crazy. Approximately 5 sets of deadlifts later, you look at the pull-down bar and you're like, fuck that. I'm just trying to go home. And of course, you won't go home because you're tough. You're going to go do pull-downs, but you're not going to try as hard as you could have if you did them fresh. Do your whole back workout, and don't you worry. Deadlifts are so stimulative and the raw stimulus magnitude is so high. As long as you do any deadlifts at the end of your plan, your back is already tired. You won't need to work very hard for deadlifts to be very effective. But if you do them fresh, you're going to need to work really hard for them to be effective because you're fresh, and that's going to beat the shit out of you for the rest of your workout. I would say it's thinking about it in reverse. Of course, if you want to deadlift as much as you possibly can, sure shit, you better deadlift first. But that's not the goal. Regional muscle hypertrophy is the goal, then especially for back. You want to do it after a whole bunch of bent rows, after pull downs, all that stuff. Folks, thank you so much for tuning in. If you want more nerdy stuff like this and even nerdier, we have a members section for you guys, a YouTube membership. It's like $5 or $6 a month, and you get extra videos. I think 1 video extra per week. And we have a team full round forum. We can build you a plan for diet, for training. It's all included. There's a huge discussion forum where you can always post a bunch of your training videos. We'll analyze the techniques, get back to you. You can ask me personal questions. There's an OnlyFans component. I'm kidding. Hopefully YouTube doesn't ban us for that comment. In any case, thanks for tuning in, guys, and I'll see you next time.